Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is the story of the most disgusting tasting medieval recipes. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the most disgusting tasting medieval recipes. If you could sit down at a medieval dinner table, you would probably recognize surprisingly little of what was being served. The bread might look familiar, and the roasted meat might even smell inviting, but that comfort would disappear the moment you discovered what had been mixed into the sauce, stuffed inside the bird, or poured into your drinking cup. The medieval kitchen was a place where survival, religion, medicine, status, and imagination all collided. The result was a collection of recipes that would leave many modern people struggling to finish even a single bite. Today, we often imagine medieval feasts as endless tables covered with roasted chickens, fresh bread, fruit, and wine. Movies and television have painted a picture of castles overflowing with delicious food. The reality was far more complicated. Some meals were genuinely wonderful, especially for wealthy nobles who could afford expensive spices and fresh game. But many other dishes were combinations that would shock even the most adventurous modern eater. Imagine biting into a pie filled with chopped animal organs, dried fruits, vinegar, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and sugar all at the same time. Or imagine being served a fish that had been left to ferment until the smell alone could empty a room. Perhaps your host proudly offers you a creamy soup thickened with animal blood, flavored with herbs, and topped with boiled brains. To medieval diners, these were not jokes or punishments. They were real recipes prepared with great care. To understand why these meals existed, we have to leave behind our modern expectations. Refrigerators did not exist. Supermarkets did not exist. Food safety regulations certainly did not exist. Every meal depended on the weather, the season, local animals, religious rules, and whatever ingredients happened to survive storage. A harsh winter could destroy crops. Heavy rain could ruin grain harvests. Disease could wipe out livestock. Even a successful harvest did not guarantee comfort. Food spoiled quickly. Meat became dangerous within days unless it was salted, smoked, dried, or heavily seasoned. Milk turned sour. Bread developed mold. Vegetables disappeared during long winters. Because people lived with constant uncertainty, they learned to use every edible part of every animal. Nothing was wasted. The tongue, liver, kidneys, lungs, heart, stomach, intestines, brain, marrow, feet, ears, eyes, and even blood all became valuable ingredients. Modern diners often reject these parts because we have abundant choices. Medieval families rarely had that luxury. Even the idea of good taste was different. Today, many people prefer clean, simple flavors. Medieval cooks often chased complexity. Sweet mixed with sour. Spicy mixed with savory. Meat combined with fruit. Sugar sprinkled over fish. Vinegar poured into desserts. Cinnamon added to beef. pepper added to wine. The stranger the combination seems today, the more likely it was considered fashionable centuries ago. One of the biggest surprises is sugar. Most people assume medieval Europeans rarely tasted sugar because it was rare and expensive. That is partly true. Sugar was considered a luxury, but wealthy households loved it so much that they added it to dishes where modern cooks would never dream of using it. Fish covered with sugar, meat sprinkled with sugar, egg dishes sweetened with sugar, rich sauces balanced with sugar and vinegar. To noble families, expensive spices were more than seasonings, they were symbols of wealth. A merchant returning from distant lands might bring cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, ginger, saffron, or black pepper. These spices cost astonishing amounts of money. Serving heavily spiced food announced that your household was prosperous enough to afford ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles. Ironically, many people today believe spices were used to hide rotten meat. Historians have found little evidence supporting that idea. Spoiled meat could make people dangerously ill, and medieval cooks understood that. Instead, spices were used because they were fashionable, prestigious, and believed to have medical benefits. Medicine and cooking were deeply connected. Medieval doctors followed the ancient theory of the four humors. According to this belief, every person contained 4 bodily fluids whose balance determined health. Every food also possessed qualities such as hot, cold, dry, or moist. Choosing the right meal could supposedly restore balance inside the body. A doctor might recommend roasted lamb instead of pork, because one was believed to be healthier for a particular condition. Another might prescribe cinnamon for digestion or ginger for warming the stomach. Meals became treatments as much as nourishment. This way of thinking produced recipes that sound bizarre today. Some dishes included ingredients specifically because they were considered medicinal rather than delicious. Herbs, roots, flowers, spices, and even precious metals occasionally found their way into expensive banquets. Religion also shaped the medieval menu. Christians observed numerous fasting days throughout the year. During many of these periods, eating meat from land animals was forbidden. Fish became the obvious substitute, but definitions of fish sometimes stretched the imagination. Beavers, for example, were occasionally classified as acceptable because they spent much of their lives in water. In some regions, certain water-dwelling animals escaped meat restrictions simply because religious authorities considered their aquatic lifestyle more important than their biological identity. As strange as this sounds today, medieval people were trying to obey religious rules while still feeding their families. Creativity often won. The medieval kitchen was also filled with smells that would overwhelm modern noses. Smoke drifted constantly from fireplaces. Salted meat hung from rafters. Herbs dried from ceiling beams. Fermenting vegetables bubbled in barrels. Cheese aged in cool corners. Beer brewed in large wooden tubs. Vinegar matured beside wine. Nothing smelled entirely fresh because freshness itself was a luxury. Cooking took place over open fires that required constant attention. Temperature control barely existed. A cook judged heat by experience, not thermometers. Every loaf of bread, every roasted bird, every simmering pot depended upon skill developed over years of practice. Mistakes happened regularly. Food burned, bread collapsed, meat dried out, sauces separated. Yet experienced cooks managed remarkable results with limited equipment. The wealthy employed entire kitchen staffs. Castles sometimes maintained dozens of workers responsible for baking, brewing, butchering, roasting, carving, washing, and serving. Large feasts became military operations, involving hundreds of dishes prepared simultaneously. Those feasts often included elaborate displays designed to amaze guests. A roasted peacock might be covered again with its brilliant feathers after cooking so it looked alive. Pies could hide live birds that flew out when the crust was cut open. Massive sculptures made from sugar decorated tables before eventually being eaten. Presentation mattered just as much as flavor. Yet beneath all the spectacle were ingredients that modern diners would struggle to accept. Blood-thickened soups, brains-filled pastries, tongues became delicacies, bone marrow-enriched sauces. Cow udders appeared on noble tables. Pig's ears were carefully seasoned. Sheep lungs were minced into puddings. Fish eggs flavored expensive meals. Nothing was wasted because waste itself was considered foolish. For peasants, life looked very different. Most ordinary people rarely enjoyed lavish feasts. Their daily meals centered around bread, porridge, beans, onions, cabbage, turnips, and whatever vegetables grew locally. Meat appeared only occasionally, often during festivals or after successful hunts. When animals were finally slaughtered, every usable piece had to last as long as possible. Salting, drying, smoking, and preserving became essential survival skills. This practical approach explains many of the recipes we now consider revolting. Medieval cooks were not trying to shock anyone. They were making the best possible use of limited resources. If an animal gave its life, every edible piece deserved respect. Over time, necessity evolved into tradition. Tradition evolved into cuisine. Eventually, these recipes became cultural favorites, passed from one generation to another. Some of them survived for centuries, others disappeared completely, and a few remain so shocking that modern chefs recreate them only as historical curiosities. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore fermented fish that smelled worse than garbage, pies packed with organs and spices, desserts that mixed meat with sugar, drinks made from ingredients no one expects, and banquet dishes so extravagant that guests often admired them more than they ate them. The medieval world was not simply a place of strange food. It was a world where every meal told a story about survival, wealth, faith, science, and imagination. The recipes may seem disgusting to us now, but to the people who created them, they represented comfort, celebration, and sometimes even hope. And some of the most unforgettable dishes are still waiting to be uncovered. Rotten fish and fermented horrors. Long before refrigeration changed the way people stored food, fish presented one of the greatest challenges in the medieval world. Unlike grain, which could survive for months in dry storage, or salted meat, which could hang for weeks in cool weather, fresh fish had a very short life.
A fish pulled from a river in the morning could already begin to spoil before the sun had set. Along the coast, fishermen raced to bring their catch to market before the smell announced the time had run out. But medieval people faced a problem that had no easy solution. Fish was not a luxury that could simply be ignored.
It was an essential source of food, especially during the countless religious fasting days when eating the meat of land animals was forbidden. In many parts of Europe, nearly a third of the calendar included some form of fasting. During those periods, fish became one of the few acceptable sources of protein. The demand was enormous, the supply was unpredictable, and preservation became a matter of survival. Today, when we hear the word fermented, we might think of yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut, or sourdough bread. These foods have pleasant, balanced flavors that result from carefully controlled fermentation. Medieval fish preservation, however, often crossed a line that modern noses would describe as horrifying. One common method was simple salting. Fresh fish were packed into wooden barrels with thick layers of salt. The salt pulled moisture from the flesh, making it difficult for harmful bacteria to grow. Properly salted fish could survive long sea voyages and long winters, yet there was a cost. The meat became incredibly salty. Before cooking, families often soaked the fish in water for hours or even days to remove some of the salt. Even then, the flavor remained intense. The texture became firm, almost chewy, and the smell lingered long after the meal had ended. For many people, this was normal. Children grew up eating it. Travelers carried it across kingdoms. Soldiers marched with barrels of it. Monks depended upon it during long fasts. What would seem unbearable today became an ordinary part of everyday life. Then there was dried fish. Along the cold northern coasts, strong winds and freezing temperatures created perfect conditions for air drying large catches. Cod was especially valued because its lean flesh dried exceptionally well. Once dried, it became so hard that striking it against a table produced a sound closer to wood than food. Eating it required patience. The fish had to be soaked for long periods before cooking. Even then, it retained a dense, fibrous texture unlike anything sold in modern supermarkets. Travelers described chewing dried fish for minutes at a time before swallowing. It was hardly enjoyable, but it lasted. And in a world where winter could stretch endlessly, lasting mattered more than luxury. Some preserved fish developed odors that challenged even the people accustomed to them. Imagine walking into a storage room lined with wooden barrels. The air is thick with damp wood, smoke from nearby fires, wet rope, old salt, and something far stronger. A sharp, sour scent hangs in the air. It reaches deep into your nose, almost burning as you breathe. Inside the barrels, fish continue to change. Tiny microorganisms break down proteins. Natural enzymes soften the flesh. The smell grows stronger. The flavor becomes more concentrated. What modern science explains through chemistry, medieval people simply accepted as part of the process. If the fish looked usable and did not make people immediately sick, it remained valuable food. Not every preserved fish was actually rotten. That is an important distinction. Many were carefully fermented under controlled conditions, even if those conditions were understood through experience rather than scientific knowledge. Generations of fishermen learned exactly how much salt to use, how long fish should remain in barrels, and when they were ready to eat. Experience replaced textbooks. Failure carried serious consequences. A spoiled barrel could mean hunger. A successful one could feed an entire household. One of the most famous examples of medieval preserved fish was stockfish, especially common in Northern Europe. Huge cod were cleaned, tied together, and hung outside during cold months. Wind slowly removed moisture until the fish became astonishingly hard. Merchants shipped stockfish across Europe because it remained edible for months without refrigeration. To many wealthy families far from the sea, receiving stockfish was a sign that long-distance trade had succeeded. The fish might have traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before reaching the dinner table. By the time it was cooked, it had already lived an extraordinary journey. Yet even stockfish was considered mild compared with some fermented varieties. Certain communities intentionally allowed fish to ferment much longer, creating flavors that became increasingly powerful. The flesh softened dramatically. The aroma intensified, until newcomers often struggled to remain in the same room. Visitors describe smells resembling strong cheese, ammonia, damp cellars, and aging seaweed mixed together. People who grew up with these foods barely noticed. Taste, after all, is learned. What one culture treasures, another may reject entirely. The truth has remained constant throughout history. Fish sauces added another layer of complexity to medieval cooking. Instead of simply preserving whole fish, some cooks allowed small fish and fish parts to break down into thick, salty liquids. These sauces were added to soups, stews, meat dishes, and vegetable recipes to provide deep, savory flavor. To modern diners, the idea of pouring fermented fish liquid onto roasted meat may sound shocking. Yet many modern cuisines continue similar traditions today through products like fish sauce and anchovy paste. The difference lies mostly in refinement and familiarity. Medieval versions were often stronger, rougher, and far less predictable. Storage conditions varied enormously. A cool cellar produced different results from a warm kitchen. Wooden barrels absorbed flavors from previous batches. No laboratory tested bacterial cultures. No expiration dates existed. Every batch reflected the experience of the people preparing it. Markets offered astonishing sights. Fresh fish lay beside salted fish. Smoked fish hung from hooks. Dried fish stood stacked like pieces of timber. Barrels overflowed with preserved catches, awaiting buyers preparing for winter. The smells blended together into an unforgettable mixture of smoke, salt, mud, river water, and the sea. For travelers entering busy port towns, the fish market announced itself long before it became visible. Dogs wandered nearby, searching for scraps. Cats waited patiently beneath wooden tables.
Seagulls circled overhead whenever markets stood near the coast. Fish sellers shouted prices while buyers squeezed flesh, inspected eyes, and argued over quality. Experience taught people which fish remained safe and which had crossed the invisible line into danger. Mistakes still happened. Food poisoning existed. People became ill. Some died. Without modern microbiology, identifying exactly why food caused sickness remained impossible. Instead, families relied upon tradition. If grandparents had preserved fish a certain way for decades, younger generations copied every detail. Recipes became survival manuals disguised as cooking instructions. Even wealthy banquets featured preserved fish. Fresh seafood was prestigious only when castles stood close to rivers or the coast. Inland nobles often depended upon preserved supplies transported over long distances. Cooks transformed these ingredients with spices, wine, onions, herbs, almonds, vinegar, and breadcrumbs, hoping to soften harsh flavors while demonstrating culinary skill. A talented cook could turn an ordinary salted fish into a dish worthy of noble guests, at least by medieval standards. Modern diners might still hesitate after the first bite. The relationship between smell and taste fascinated medieval people in ways they never fully explained. A powerful odor did not automatically signal bad food. Some of the strongest smelling dishes were also considered the richest and most satisfying. Familiarity changed perception. Children raised in fishing villages learned to associate the smell of drying cod with security. The scent drifting from barrels meant winter supplies were ready. The aroma filling the kitchen meant another meal was coming. To them, those smells represented comfort. To outsiders, they represented disgust. Centuries later, historians studying old recipe books often posit descriptions of fish dishes that combine ingredients few modern chefs would dare to mix. Salted herring cooked with raisins. Dried cod simmered in almond milk. Fish stewed with cinnamon, cloves, saffron vinegar, and sugar. Pike served beneath sweet fruit sauces. Eel roasted with aromatic herbs and finished with sweet spices. None of these combinations seemed strange to medieval cooks. Their world followed different rules. Their kitchens valued preservation over freshness, abundance over simplicity, and boldness over restraint. The result was a cuisine that could appear shocking to modern eyes while making perfect sense to the people who depended upon it. And as unusual as fermented fish might seem, it was only the beginning. The medieval kitchen still held recipes built around blood, brains, lungs, hearts, stomachs, and every other part of an animal that today's diners often leave behind. Those dishes would prove even more surprising than anything that emerged from a barrel of aging fish, blood, brains, and bowels. Why medieval cooks used every part of the animal. If fermented fish challenged the medieval appetite, the slaughterhouse revealed an even stranger side of everyday cooking. For many people today, buying meat means selecting a neatly packaged steak, a few chicken breasts, or perhaps some ground beef wrapped in plastic. The animal itself remains invisible.
Most modern consumers never see the slaughter, never watch the butchering,
and rarely think about the dozens of edible parts that never make it onto supermarket shelves. In the Middle Ages, that separation did not exist. Everyone knew exactly where meat came from. Children watched animals being raised.
Farmers cared for them throughout the year. Families sometimes named them. And when the time came, they also watched them die. Slaughtering an animal was not merely the beginning of a meal. It was an event that demanded speed, skill, and careful planning. Every minute counted. Without refrigeration, valuable meat could spoil quickly, especially during warmer months. Every edible piece had to be processed before it was lost. Nothing could be wasted. To a medieval household, waste was more than careless. It could mean the difference between surviving the winter and facing hunger before spring. The muscles that modern diners prefer made up only part of the animal. Hidden beneath the skin and inside the body were organs rich in nutrients, fat, and flavor. Medieval cooks understood their value long before nutrition became a science. The liver was prized. The heart was carefully cleaned and roasted. Kidneys were chopped into stews. Tongues were boiled until tender. Lungs found their way into puddings. Stomachs became cooking vessels. Even the feet and ears were transformed into meals. Modern diners often call these ingredients offal, a word that carries an unfortunate reputation. Yet for centuries, these foods were perfectly ordinary. In many cases, they were considered delicacies. Among the most unusual ingredients was blood. Today, the sight of blood on a dinner plate makes many people uncomfortable. Medieval cooks felt very differently. Fresh animal blood was one of the most versatile ingredients in the kitchen. It thickened soups, enriched sauces, filled sausages, and formed the base of hearty stews that could feed large families with relatively little meat. The key was speed. Blood begins to clot almost immediately after an animal is killed. Cooks stirred it continuously as it was collected, sometimes mixing it with vinegar or salt to slow the clotting process. Once prepared, it could be combined with onions, herbs, oats, breadcrumbs, or spices before being cooked. The result varied from region to region. Some recipes produced thick, dark soups. Others created firm puddings, sliced into neat portions. Some became sausages, stuffed into cleaned intestines. Others disappeared into rich gravies where diners might never realize what they were eating. To medieval people, blood represented nourishment, not horror. It contained strength. It contained warmth. And according to many medical beliefs of the time, it possessed qualities that could restore energy after illness or exhaustion. The brain inspired equally mixed reactions. Preparing brains required patience. The skull had to be opened carefully without damaging the soft tissue inside. Once removed, the brains were soaked, cleaned, and gently cooked before being added to pies, pastries, or scrambled egg dishes. The texture surprised those unfamiliar with it. Soft, creamy, almost buttery. Rather than serving brains alone, medieval cooks usually mixed them with herbs, eggs, breadcrumbs, onions, and spices. These additions balanced both texture and flavor while stretching a relatively small ingredient into a meal that could feed several people.
Even royal kitchens recorded recipes using brains. Nothing about them seemed unusual. What shocks modern readers is simply the passage of time. Perhaps the stomach demanded even greater skill. Far from being discarded, animal stomachs became valuable cooking tools. After thorough cleaning, they served as natural containers for mixtures of chopped meat, grains, herbs, onions, fat, and blood. The stuffed stomach was then boiled or roasted until everything inside cooked together. The process required experience. Cleaning had to be meticulous. Any mistake could ruin the meal. Yet skilled cooks transformed an organ many people now reject into one of the largest and most satisfying dishes on the table. Intestines served another purpose. Before artificial casings existed, cleaned intestines became nature's perfect sausage wrappers. They stretched without tearing, held fillings securely, and allowed smoke or boiling water to cook everything evenly. Inside those casings went almost anything: minced pork, beef, liver, fat, blood, herbs, barley, oats, breadcrumbs, sometimes dried fruits, sometimes expensive spices if the household could afford them. Each village developed its own traditions, passing recipes from parents to children over generations. Some of those sausages still survive today, though modern versions often use cleaner preparation methods and different seasonings. The tongue occupied a curious place in medieval cuisine. Preparing it was slow work. The thick outer skin had to be removed after boiling, revealing surprisingly tender meat underneath. Once peeled, the tongue could be sliced thinly and served with mustard, vinegar sauces, or aromatic spices. Travelers often remarked that properly cooked tongue resembled fine cuts of beef. Despite coming from a part of the animal many outsiders ignored, the heart carried symbolic importance as well. Because it represented courage and life itself, serving the heart sometimes held ceremonial meaning during important feasts. Cooked carefully, the dense muscle became surprisingly flavorful, especially when marinated with wine, herbs, and pepper before roasting. Of all the organs, however, the kidneys perhaps divided opinion the most. Even today, kidneys possess a distinctive aroma that some people appreciate, while others find overwhelming. Medieval cooks tried to soften that intensity by soaking them, trimming away tough tissue, and surrounding them with onions, wine, vinegar, parsley, sage, or strong spices. Whether those efforts succeeded depended greatly upon the cook. A talented kitchen could produce a memorable meal. An inexperienced one could create a smell that lingered throughout the house. Bone marrow offered a completely different experience. Long bones were split open, revealing rich, creamy fat hidden inside. This marrow melted beautifully into soups, sauces, and pies, adding luxurious texture without requiring expensive ingredients. Modern chefs have rediscovered bone marrow in fine restaurants, yet medieval cooks never forgot its value. It was filling, it was flavorful, and it wasted nothing. Perhaps no ingredient demonstrated medieval practicality better than the humble pig. People often say that every part of the pig can be used, and medieval families took that saying seriously. The ears were cooked until tender. The snout appeared in stews. The trotters enriched broths with natural gelatin. The skin became crackling. Fat turned into lard for cooking. Blood filled sausages. Intestines became casings.
Even the bladder occasionally served practical household purposes after careful cleaning. Very little disappeared. Pig provided food, cooking fat, storage materials, and trade goods all at once. This complete use of the animal reflected necessity rather than extravagance. Winter slaughter was especially important. Cold weather slowed spoilage, allowing families to preserve larger quantities of meat. Entire communities often worked together during these busy weeks. Neighbors helped butcher animals, prepare sausages, salt meat, and smoke hams before freezing temperatures changed. The work was exhausting, yet it also became a celebration. Children watched, stories were shared, recipes were exchanged. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. Many of the dishes born during these gatherings survived for centuries. Not because they tasted extraordinary by modern standards, but because they represented security. A full smokehouse meant survival. A barrel of preserved sausages meant fewer worries when snow covered the fields. A pot of blood pudding meant nothing valuable had been wasted. Looking back with modern eyes, it is easy to describe these recipes as disgusting. But doing so risks missing the deeper truth hidden beneath every unusual ingredient. The medieval kitchen was built on respect. Respect for food. Respect for labor. Respect for the lives of animals that sustained human life. Using every edible part was not simply practical. It was considered morally responsible. Throwing away perfectly edible organs would have seemed far stranger to a medieval cook than eating them. That difference in perspective explains why recipe books from the period mention brains, blood, hearts, lungs, kidneys, and stomachs with almost no special explanation. Their readers already understood. These ingredients belonged in the kitchen just as naturally as onions, herbs, or bread. The real surprise came not from what was cooked, but from how creatively it was transformed. Skilled cooks layered flavors with wine, vinegar, honey, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, parsley, sage, and dozens of other seasonings. They wrapped humble ingredients in delicate pastry, simmered them into fragrant stews, or presented them at grand feasts as symbols of abundance. To modern diners, the ingredient list may inspire hesitation. To medieval guests, it inspired admiration. And despite everything they did with blood and organs, there was one medieval obsession that confused visitors perhaps more than any other. It involved a spice so expensive that it was worth its weight in precious metals. Yet cooks scattered it through recipes with astonishing enthusiasm. They believed it could improve almost any dish, whether it contained fish, meat, fruit, or even organs. That obsession would transform medieval cooking into one of the most richly seasoned cuisines in European history. A kingdom of spices, when cinnamon, cloves, and sugar covered everything. Walk into the kitchen of a wealthy medieval household just before a grand feast,
and the first thing that would surprise you would not be the meat roasting over the fire or the fresh bread coming from the oven. It would be the smell. The air would be heavy with aromas that most modern people associate with desserts and holiday baking. Cinnamon drifted through the room. Cloves filled the air with their sharp sweetness. Ginger added warmth. Nutmeg contributed a rich, earthy fragrance. Saffron-colored sauces a brilliant golden yellow. Black pepper lingered in nearly every corner of the kitchen. Yet very few of these ingredients were being prepared for cakes or cookies. They were destined for roasted beef, for boiled fish, for venison pies, for thick meat stews, for poultry, even for sauces served over animal organs. To modern tastes, this combination feels almost backwards. We naturally separate sweet flavors from savory ones. Cinnamon belongs on apple pie. Sugar belongs in desserts. Cloves flavor holiday drinks, but medieval cooks did not think in those categories. They viewed flavor as something far more complex, where sweetness, sourness, bitterness, spice, and richness all belong together. A single dish might contain vinegar, honey, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, onions, wine, and roasted meat at exactly the same time. The result was a flavor unlike anything most people experience today. This love affair with spices began thousands of miles away. None of these ingredients grew naturally across most of Europe. Cinnamon came from the bark of trees in Asia. Cloves were harvested from tiny flower buds growing on islands in present-day Indonesia. Nutmeg and mace traveled from the same distant region. Ginger arrived through long trading networks stretching across continents. Pepper crossed oceans and deserts before finally reaching European markets. Every handful of spice represented an extraordinary journey. Merchants carried them by ship across dangerous seas. Caravans transported them over scorching deserts. Taxes accumulated at every border. Middlemen bought and sold them repeatedly before they finally reached European cities. By the time a noble family purchased a small pouch of cloves or cinnamon, its price had increased many times over. That expense turned spices into symbols of wealth. A wealthy lord could demonstrate his power without saying a single word. He only had to invite guests to dinner. The more exotic the flavors, the greater the impression. Visitors immediately recognized the value sitting on their plates. A heavily seasoned feast quietly announced that the host possessed money, influence, and connections, reaching far beyond the local countryside. Some nobles even competed with one another. One banquet might feature generous amounts of cinnamon. The next would use even more saffron. Another host would proudly serve dishes flavored with several expensive spices at once. The competition became less about necessity and more about prestige. Today, people often repeat the story that medieval cooks used spices to hide the taste of spoiled meat. It sounds believable. Unfortunately, it is also largely a myth. Spoiled meat could make people dangerously ill. Even without understanding bacteria, medieval people recognized that rotten food was dangerous.
Throwing expensive spices onto spoiled meat would not magically make it safe. In fact, wasting valuable seasonings on meat that should have been discarded would have made little economic sense. Instead, spices were used because they tasted fashionable, demonstrated wealth, and fit comfortably within medieval ideas about health. According to the medical theories of the time, every food possessed certain natural qualities. Some foods were considered hot. Others were cold. Some were dry. Others were moist. Maintaining balance between these qualities supposedly helped preserve health. Spices played an important role in that system. Ginger was believed to warm the body. Pepper stimulated digestion. Cinnamon strengthened the stomach. Cloves freshened the breath. Whether these beliefs were scientifically accurate mattered less than the confidence people placed in them. Cooking and medicine were deeply connected. A rich sauce seasoned with ginger and cinnamon could be viewed as both delicious and beneficial. That belief encouraged cooks to use spices generously whenever they could afford them. Perhaps the greatest surprise for modern readers is the role of sugar. Today, sugar is ordinary. It fills supermarket shelves. Children stir it into cereal without thinking. In medieval Europe, sugar was a luxury. Imported from distant lands, it remained expensive enough that many ordinary families rarely tasted it. When wealthy households purchased sugar, they did not reserve it exclusively for desserts. Quite the opposite. Sugar appeared in recipes that modern diners would consider unmistakably savory. Roasted chicken might receive a dusting of sugar before serving. Fish could be finished with sweetened sauces. Stewed beef sometimes included both sugar and vinegar. Even egg dishes occasionally balanced sweetness against pepper and herbs. The goal was harmony. Medieval cooks admired contrasts. Sweet met sour, hot met cool, rich met sharp. No single flavor dominated the plate. Instead, every bite offered layers that unfolded one after another. A guest might first notice sweetness, then pepper, then vinegar, then cinnamon. Finally, the richness of roasted meat. To modern palates accustomed to clearer separation between sweet and savory, these combinations often seem confusing. To medieval diners, they represented culinary sophistication. Sauces became the perfect place to display this complexity. A cook might begin with wine, add breadcrumbs to thicken it, mix in vinegar for acidity, stir in ground almonds for richness, season generously with cinnamon, ginger, pepper, cloves, and saffron. Finish with honey or sugar. Then pour the finished sauce over roasted goose. The result bore little resemblance to the simple gravies served today. It was thick, fragrant, sweet, tangy, spicy, and intensely aromatic. Color mattered almost as much as flavor. Golden sauces impressed guests. Bright red dishes attracted attention. Deep green herb mixtures decorated expensive platters. Saffron became especially prized because only a tiny amount transformed an ordinary meal into something visually spectacular. Harvesting saffron required incredible patience. Each flower produced only 3 delicate threads. Thousands of flowers were needed to collect even a small quantity. No wonder wealthy cooks treated it as one of their most treasured ingredients.
Some feasts became almost theatrical.
A white sauce might accompany one course. A brilliant yellow sauce followed. Next came a vivid green herb puree. Finally, a dark spice gravy finished the meal. Every course offered something visually different. Guests admired not only the food itself, but also the cook's ability to control color, texture, and aroma. The pursuit of impressive flavors occasionally led to combinations that seem astonishing today. Imagine roasted eels sprinkled with sugar, venison served beside sweet cherries and cinnamon, chicken simmered with raisins and cloves, pork accompanied by apples, ginger, pepper, and vinegar. To medieval diners, these combinations reflected balance. To modern diners, they often taste surprisingly unfamiliar. The influence of imported spices reached beyond noble castles. Successful merchants gradually adopted similar recipes. Wealthy monasteries experimented with them. Urban households copied fashionable dishes whenever finances allowed. Even ordinary families occasionally purchased small amounts for important holidays or weddings. A pinch of pepper could transform a celebration. A little ginger made guests feel honored. A spoonful of sugar signaled generosity. Not everyone approved. Some religious writers criticized excessive luxury at the dinner table. They argued that simple food encouraged humility, while extravagant seasoning tempted pride and gluttony. Others worried that enormous spending on imported spices reflected vanity rather than wisdom. Yet criticism changed very little. The appetite for exotic flavors continued to grow. Trade expanded. Merchants became richer. More spices arrived every year. By the late Middle Ages, recipe collections overflowed with instructions calling for combinations of cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, pepper, nutmeg, mace, sugar, honey, vinegar, and wine. Many recipes listed half a dozen expensive ingredients in a single sauce. The message was clear. Great cooking demanded great seasoning. Perhaps the strangest part is that medieval cooks were not trying to overwhelm the taste of meat. They wanted every ingredient to remain noticeable. The spices were partners rather than disguises. A successful dish achieved harmony instead of domination. Centuries later, food historians attempting to recreate these recipes often describe an unexpected experience. The dishes are neither completely sweet nor completely savory. They resemble neither modern European cuisine nor modern desserts. Instead, they belong to a culinary world with entirely different rules. Some tasters find them fascinating. Others struggle to finish a single bite. But everyone agrees on one thing. No one expects roasted meat to taste quite like Christmas. And just when guests believed they had experienced every unusual flavor imaginable, medieval cooks introduced something even more astonishing. They began rebuilding entire animals after cooking them, sewing feathers back onto roasted birds, hiding surprises inside giant pies, and transforming dinner into a performance that blurred the line between food and entertainment. The Feast of Illusions. Peacocks, swans, and pies that came alive. If an ordinary medieval meal was meant to satisfy hunger, a royal banquet had a very different purpose. Food certainly mattered, but the feast was also a demonstration of wealth, authority,
and imagination. Every course was carefully planned to surprise the guests. Every platter was expected to tell a story. The greatest compliment a noble host could receive was not simply that the food tasted good, but that the guests left astonished by what they had witnessed. For wealthy families, dinner was entertainment. Long before theaters became common, before fireworks illuminated the night sky, and before concerts filled grand halls, the dining table itself became the stage. Cooks were expected to do far more than prepare food. They were artists, engineers, and illusionists, whose creations blurred the line between cooking and performance. The wealthiest kitchens employed specialists who spent days preparing a single feast. Bakers shaped elaborate pastries into castles, towers, and mythical creatures. Sugar workers molded delicate sculptures of flowers, animals, and saints. Carvers transformed roasted meats into displays that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Then came the birds. No animal represented medieval extravagance quite like the peacock. To modern eyes, a peacock is admired for its brilliant feathers, shimmering blues and greens that catch the sunlight in breathtaking patterns. Medieval nobles saw exactly the same beauty and wondered whether that beauty could become part of the dinner table. The answer was yes. But preparing such a dish required extraordinary effort. The bird had to be carefully skinned before cooking so that its magnificent feathers remained intact. Every feather was preserved in its original position. The meat was then roasted separately over an open fire until fully cooked. Once the cooking was complete, the real work began. The roasted bird was placed back inside its original skin. Its colorful feathers were carefully arranged. The neck and head were often reattached. Sometimes the beak was gilded with gold leaf. Occasionally, small pieces of cotton soaked in alcohol were placed inside the beak and set alight just before serving, creating the illusion that the magnificent bird was breathing fire. Imagine seeing such a creature carried into a candlelit banquet hall. From a distance, it looked alive. Only when it reached the table did guests realize they were expected to eat it. The effect was unforgettable. The meat itself, however, rarely matched the spectacle. Modern cooks who have studied historical accounts often describe peacock meat as tough, lean, and far less flavorful than chicken or turkey. Its greatest value was never its taste. Its beauty was the attraction. The feathers were the true luxury. Swans occupied a similar place among Europe's elite. Graceful and elegant, they symbolized nobility, purity, and prestige. In many regions, swans were protected by law, and ownership of them became a privilege reserved for the highest levels of society. Serving roasted swan at a banquet immediately communicated status. Like peacocks, swans were sometimes reconstructed after cooking. Their white feathers were carefully cleaned and reattached. Their long necks curved gracefully above enormous serving platters. Gold decorations, ribbons, and embroidered cloth often surrounded the finished presentation. Guests admired the display before anyone reached for a knife. Whether the meat deserved such admiration was another matter. Many descriptions suggest that swan meat was dense and chewy, requiring long cooking times to become edible. The impressive appearance mattered far more than tenderness. Appearance always came first. Even ordinary birds could become extraordinary in the hands of a skilled medieval cook. Chickens were painted with saffron until they glowed bright yellow. Egg whites created glossy finishes. Herbs added brilliant green decorations. Silver and gold leaf covered pastries served to the wealthiest guests. The meal became a feast for the eyes long before it reached the tongue. Then there were the pies. Modern pies usually reveal their contents immediately after being sliced. Medieval pies often concealed secrets. Large pastry shells acted as containers rather than food. Thick crusts protected fillings during long cooking times and allowed cooks to transport dishes without spilling their contents. Some pies held richly seasoned venison. Others contained birds layered with fruit and spices. Some enclosed fish mixed with almonds, raisins, wine, and herbs. But the most famous pies contained something entirely unexpected: live birds. The birds were not baked inside the pie. Instead, once the empty pastry shell had finished baking and cooled slightly, small living birds were carefully placed inside through an opening. The opening was sealed. The pie appeared perfectly ordinary. Then it was carried into the banquet hall. At exactly the right moment, the crust was cut open. Suddenly, the trapped birds burst into the air, flying wildly across the room. Guests gasped, some laughed, others ducked as wings brushed past their faces. Servants hurried to open windows before the frightened birds crashed into walls or ceiling beams. The pie itself had become a performance. Centuries later, this remarkable tradition survived in the nursery rhyme about 4 blackbirds baked in a pie. The rhyme sounds absurd today, yet it echoes an entertainment that genuinely amazed medieval audiences. Not every surprise involved living creatures. Some pastries concealed messages written on parchment. Others hid flowers. Small gifts occasionally appeared inside desserts. One feast might reveal musicians emerging from enormous decorative structures placed beside the table. Another featured mechanical devices powered by hidden weights that caused birds to flap their wings or dragons to move their heads. Engineers and cooks often worked together. The result was dinner unlike anything most people had ever experienced. Color itself became an illusion. Natural ingredients allowed cooks to transform familiar foods into impossible shades. Parsley produced vibrant green. Saffron created golden yellow. Ground sandalwood offered rich reds. Burnt bread darkened sauces until they resembled polished ebony. A single roast could display several different colors simply by covering each section with different sauces. Guests marveled at the transformation. Even eggs became opportunities for deception. Some cooks emptied eggshells through tiny holes, mixed the contents with herbs or spices, then poured the mixture back inside before carefully sealing the shell. When diners cracked the eggs, they discovered colors and flavors they never expected. Others layered different fillings inside pastries
so that every slice revealed an entirely new pattern. Every course invited curiosity. Every platter challenged expectations. The greatest feasts sometimes stretched across dozens of courses. Not every guest sampled every dish. That was never the goal. Abundance itself conveyed power. A host who could afford to serve far more food than anyone could possibly eat demonstrated enormous wealth. Visitors carried stories of these banquets to distant kingdoms. Word spread quickly. People remembered spectacular displays for years. Some rulers intentionally used feasts as political tools. Foreign ambassadors invited to dinner witnessed not only military strength or financial success, but also cultural sophistication. An astonishing banquet suggested an equally astonishing kingdom. Food became diplomacy. Yet behind all the glitter lay countless hours of exhausting labor. Kitchen workers chopped mountains of vegetables. Butchers processed entire herds of animals. Bakers tended blazing ovens through the night. Servants polished silver, arranged platters, and carried heavy dishes through crowded halls. One magnificent evening represented weeks of preparation. Failure was not an option. A collapsed pastry, burnt roast, or poorly timed surprise could embarrass an entire household. The pressure on medieval cooks was immense. Ironically, despite all this effort, many of these celebrated dishes would probably disappoint modern diners if judged purely by flavor. The meat was often overcooked by today's standards. The spices remained unusually intense. Sauces leaned heavily toward sweet and sour combinations, unfamiliar to contemporary tastes. Presentation frequently overshadowed tenderness. Spectacle outweighed subtlety. That was exactly the point. A medieval feast was never intended to resemble an intimate family dinner. It was theater. It was politics. It was advertising. It was a public declaration that the host possessed resources beyond imagination. Guests expected to be surprised. They expected stories they could repeat for the rest of their lives. And sometimes the strangest stories came not from magnificent birds or magical pies, but from the curious belief that certain foods could cure illness, strengthen the body, or even protect the soul. In medieval kitchens, the boundary between medicine and cooking was so thin that a dinner recipe could easily become a doctor's prescription. Ingredients that seem bizarre today were often added not because they tasted good, but because people sincerely believed they possessed remarkable healing powers. Those beliefs would shape some of the most unusual recipes ever written, blending herbs, spices, animal parts, and ancient medical theories into meals that promised far more than simple nourishment, eating to heal. When medicine and dinner were the same thing. For a modern person, there is a clear difference between food and medicine. Breakfast belongs in the kitchen. Medicine belongs in the bathroom cabinet. One is chosen because it tastes good or provides nutrition. The other is taken because it treats illness, and many people expect it to taste unpleasant. These two worlds are usually kept separate. A medieval household would have found that distinction rather strange. To them, nearly everything placed on the table had the potential to influence the body's health. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of soup,
Every roasted bird, every piece of fruit, and every cup of wine carried qualities that were believed to affect the body's natural balance. Dinner was never just dinner. It was treatment. It was prevention. It was, in many ways, a daily medical prescription. This idea was rooted in a system of medicine that had shaped European thinking for more than 1,000 years. According to learned physicians, the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health depended on keeping these humors in perfect balance. Illness appeared when that balance was disturbed. Someone who felt sluggish might be thought to have too much phlegm. A person with a fever was believed to possess excessive heat. Melancholy, anger, weakness, sleeplessness, poor digestion, headaches, and countless other problems were all explained through this invisible system. The cure often began with food. Every ingredient was believed to have its own natural character. Some foods were considered hot, others were cold. Some were moist, others were dry. The challenge was to combine them correctly. If someone suffered from what physicians considered an excess of coldness, warming foods like ginger, pepper, cinnamon, or garlic might be recommended. If a patient seemed overheated, cooling vegetables or fruits could be suggested instead. It was an elegant theory. It was also completely different from modern medical science. Yet for centuries, people trusted it because it seemed to explain the world around them. Medical knowledge came from respected scholars, ancient authorities, monasteries, and universities. Questioning these ideas was uncommon. Following them was simply part of daily life. As a result, medieval recipe books often look less like cookbooks and more like collections of medical advice disguised as meals. Take chicken broth, for example. Today, many people still reach for chicken soup when they catch a cold. That tradition has surprisingly deep roots. Medieval physicians frequently recommended gentle broths made from chicken because they were believed to restore strength without overwhelming a weakened stomach. The broth was simmered slowly for hours. Herbs such as parsley, sage, or fennel might be added. Sometimes ginger or saffron appeared in wealthier households. The finished soup was considered both nourishing and healing. Not every remedy was so familiar. Eels occupied a curious place in medieval medicine. Because they lived in water and possessed rich, oily flesh, opinions about them varied widely. Some physicians praised eel for building strength. Others warned that it was difficult to digest and should only be eaten under specific circumstances. Patients often followed whichever advice their local physician happened to favor. The same uncertainty surrounded pork. Some considered it highly nourishing. Others believed it produced dangerous imbalances unless carefully prepared with spices. Recipes therefore became increasingly complicated. Pepper corrected one problem, vinegar balanced another, ginger restored warmth, honey softened harsh flavors while supposedly improving digestion. Cooking became an exercise in invisible mathematics where every ingredient attempted to balance another. Even beverages carried medical importance. Wine rarely served only as a drink.
Physicians frequently prescribed wines infused with herbs, spices, flowers, or roots. Some mixtures were intended to improve circulation. Others promised better digestion. Certain recipes claimed to sharpen memory. Still others supposedly protected travelers from disease. Whether these drinks truly worked is another question entirely, but belief itself gave them tremendous power. People trusted them. That trust shaped generations of culinary tradition. Honey held a similarly remarkable reputation. Long before refined sugar became common, honey sweetened countless recipes. Yet sweetness was only part of its appeal. Honey was believed to soothe sore throats. It appeared in cough remedies. It flavored medicinal drinks. It preserved fruits. It coated herbs that would otherwise taste unbearably bitter. Many households regarded honey as one of nature's greatest gifts. Garlic inspired even stronger opinions. Its powerful smell divided people much as it does today. Peasants ate it regularly because it grew easily and added flavor to simple meals. Many physicians admired it as well. Garlic was thought to warm the body, stimulate digestion, and help protect against certain illnesses. Travelers sometimes carried cloves of garlic on long journeys. Workers consumed it before difficult labor. Its reputation extended far beyond the dinner table. Onions enjoyed similar respect. Cheap, easy to grow, and capable of lasting through the winter, onions appeared in nearly every kitchen. They thickened soups, flavored stews, filled pies, accompanied roasted meats. At the same time, they were praised for their supposed medicinal qualities. For medieval families, there was little reason to separate practical nutrition from healing. Some of the most unusual recipes involved almonds. Fresh cow's milk spoiled quickly, especially during warm weather. Religious fasting rules also limited the use of animal products on many days. Ground almonds offered an elegant solution. Mixed with water and strained through cloth, they produced almond milk. This creamy liquid became one of the most important ingredients in wealthy medieval kitchens. Almond milk appeared in soups, sauces, fish dishes, rice puddings, vegetable stews, even medicinal preparations. Its gentle flavor made it suitable for the sick. Its long shelf life made it practical. Its expense made it fashionable. Many surviving recipes treat almond milk almost as a universal ingredient. The wealthy consumed astonishing quantities of it. Eggs also occupied an interesting position. Soft-boiled eggs were often recommended for people recovering from illness because they were believed to digest easily. Hard-boiled eggs, on the other hand, sometimes received criticism from physicians who argued they were too difficult for weak stomachs. Cooking time itself could become a medical decision. The same was true for bread. Fresh bread was not always considered ideal. Some physicians believed slightly stale bread digested more efficiently. Others recommended different grains depending on the patient's condition. Even something as ordinary as a loaf of bread became part of medical theory. Fruit caused endless debate. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, grapes. Each inspired competing opinions among learned writers. Some argued fruit should only be eaten before meals. Others insisted it belonged afterward. Many warned against eating too much raw fruit, believing it encouraged illness. Cooking fruit with honey and spices supposedly made it safer. Once again, recipes reflected medicine rather than simple taste. Perhaps the strangest aspect of medieval healing was its willingness to blur the line between ordinary ingredients and rare luxuries. Powdered pearl occasionally appeared in remedies prepared for royalty. Gold leaf decorated expensive medicines, as well as extravagant feasts. Ambergris, a rare substance produced within sperm whales and prized for its fragrance, found occasional use in elite kitchens and medicinal preparations despite its unusual origin. To modern readers, these ingredients sound almost mythical. To medieval nobles, they represented access to the finest care money could buy. Of course, not every remedy helped. Some accomplished little. Others may have provided comfort without addressing the illness itself. A few were almost certainly harmful. Without modern scientific testing, people relied upon observation, tradition, and authority. If a respected physician recommended a particular broth or herbal wine, families followed the advice faithfully. Hope often became as important as evidence, yet not all medieval medicine was misguided. Certain herbs genuinely possessed useful properties. Honey has natural antibacterial qualities. Garlic contains compounds now known to affect microorganisms. Some plants ease digestion, others reduced inflammation. People occasionally stumbled upon effective treatments through centuries of practical experience, even if their explanations were scientifically inaccurate. This mixture of careful observation and mistaken theory defined medieval medicine. It also defined medieval cooking. The kitchen became the household pharmacy. The cook became part physician. Meals were prepared not only to satisfy hunger, but also to preserve health, prevent disease, restore strength, and maintain balance within the body. Looking back, many recipes seem bewildering. Why would roasted meat require cinnamon, ginger, vinegar, and sugar? Why should soup contain herbs selected according to invisible bodily qualities? Why did physicians debate whether a pear should be eaten before or after dinner? The answers lie in a world view where every bite mattered. Nothing entered the body without consequence. Food shaped health. Health shaped life. And life itself often depended on making the right choices at the dinner table. For medieval people, those choices felt perfectly logical. Yet despite all their concern for health, there remained one unavoidable reality that no amount of spices, herbs, or medical theory could overcome. Food still spoiled. Markets still smelled. Cheese continued to age. Meat continued to rot. And the methods people invented to preserve those precious ingredients sometimes produced aromas so powerful that even experienced travelers struggled to describe them. The next chapter ventures into the cellars, smokehouses, and aging rooms where some of the strongest smells in medieval Europe were born, revealing cheeses, preserved meats, and fermented foods that tested the limits of even the bravest appetite. The smell of survival. Cheese, rot, and the art of preservation. Imagine waking before sunrise on a cold winter morning sometime in the 14th century. Outside, the fields are frozen beneath a thin layer of frost. Nothing fresh grows in the gardens anymore. The fruit trees stand bare, streams move slowly beneath sheets of ice. Hunting has become difficult, and the next harvest is still many months away. Yet inside the farmhouse, people are eating. Not because food is plentiful, because months earlier, they prepared for this exact moment. The greatest challenge facing medieval families was not finding food during summer. Warm weather filled gardens with vegetables, forests with berries, rivers with fish, and fields with grain. The real challenge was making those foods survive until winter. Every autumn became a race against time. Families worked from dawn until darkness, preserving everything they could before cold weather arrived. Vegetables disappeared into barrels. Meat entered smokehouses. Herbs hung from wooden beams. Apples were dried beside the fire. Fish were salted. Milk became cheese. Nothing could be wasted. Because once snow covered the roads and storms isolated villages, fresh food became a distant memory. Preservation was no longer a choice. It was survival. Among all preserved foods, none played a greater role than cheese. Today, supermarkets offer hundreds of varieties from around the world. Most are carefully refrigerated, consistently produced, and sold at predictable stages of maturity. Medieval cheese was far less predictable. Every village had its own methods. Every season produced different milk. Every herd grazed on different plants. Every cheesemaker relied on personal experience rather than scientific measurements. The result was endless variety. Some cheeses were soft and fresh, eaten within days. Others aged for months. A few remained in storage for years, growing harder, stronger, and far more pungent with time. For many families, cheese represented stored sunshine. Throughout spring and summer, cows, sheep, and goats transformed fresh grass into rich milk. Cheesemakers transformed that milk into something capable of surviving the winter. The process itself seemed almost magical. Warm milk received rennet, an enzyme traditionally obtained from the stomach of young calves, lambs, or goats. Slowly, the liquid thickened. Curds separated from whey. The curds were gathered, pressed, salted, and shaped. Then came the waiting. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. During that time, invisible changes transformed ordinary milk into one of the most important foods of the medieval world. No one understood bacteria. No one knew about microscopic fungi. Yet generations of experience taught people exactly how to care for aging cheese. Some wheels were turned every day. Others were rubbed with salt. Certain varieties developed natural rinds. Others attracted molds that gradually changed both flavor and texture. To modern science, these changes are biological processes. To medieval cheesemakers, they were simply signs that the cheese was maturing as expected. The smell, however, could be extraordinary. Walk into an aging room filled with hundreds of cheese wheels, and the air would be thick with earthy aromas. There were hints of damp stone, wet straw, fermenting milk, cellars cooled by centuries-old walls. As cheeses aged, many developed increasingly powerful scents. Some became nutty. Others grew sharp enough to sting the nose. Visitors unfamiliar with these aromas often struggled to understand why anyone would willingly eat such food. Those who grew up with it barely noticed. The strongest cheeses frequently inspired the greatest admiration. Age meant value. Time meant flavor. A wheel that had survived many months represented patience, careful storage, and successful craftsmanship. Its powerful aroma became evidence of quality rather than spoilage. Modern people often use the phrase, "It smells like old cheese," as an insult. For medieval diners, that same smell could signal something precious waiting beneath the rind. Not every preserved dairy product became cheese. Butter also demanded careful handling. Fresh butter spoiled quickly. To make it last, families often packed it with generous amounts of salt. The result bore little resemblance to the lightly salted butter found in modern kitchens. It was dense, strong, sometimes almost overwhelming. Salt protected it from rapid decay, but it also transformed the flavor into something much more intense. Cooking with such butter meant adjusting every recipe. Salted butter flavored vegetables, enriched stews, coated bread melted into porridges. Its taste became a familiar part of everyday life. Milk itself presented another problem. Fresh milk could sour within hours during warm weather. Instead of treating sour milk as a disaster, medieval households often accepted it as part of the natural cycle. Soured milk found its way into cooking. It appeared in porridges, breads, simple soups. Waste remained the true enemy. If food could still be used safely, people found a purpose for it. The same philosophy guided the preservation of meat. Freshly slaughtered animals represented enormous wealth. But without preservation, much of that meat would disappear long before it could be eaten. Salt became one solution. Smoke became another. Smokehouses stood beside countless farms across Europe. Inside these dark buildings, strips of pork, beef, mutton, and sausage hung from wooden beams above slow-burning fires. The goal was never to cook the meat completely. Instead, cool smoke gradually removed moisture while coating every surface with protective compounds. The process required days, sometimes weeks. Wood choice mattered. Oak produced one flavor, beech another. Fruit woods added subtle sweetness. Every region developed its own traditions. The finished meat emerged darker, firmer, and carrying the unmistakable aroma of wood smoke. To modern diners accustomed to mild supermarket ham, medieval smoked meat would probably taste astonishingly intense. Salt reinforced every bite. Smoke lingered long after swallowing. The texture demanded determined chewing. Yet these qualities meant the food could survive for months. That mattered far more than tenderness. Certain preserved meats aged in ways that seem almost alarming today. Large hams sometimes hung from rafters for extended periods. Air slowly dried them. Natural molds occasionally appeared on the surface. Experienced households recognized which growths were harmless and which signaled danger. Cleaning, trimming, and careful inspection became routine parts of food preparation. Knowledge passed through generations rather than written manuals. One mistake could waste an entire season's work. Or worse, preserved sausages presented similar challenges. After being stuffed into natural casings, they were smoked, dried, or both. Some became firm enough to slice thinly. Others remained soft and required cooking before eating. Spices helped flavor them. Salt protected them. Dry air finished the job. Even then, families inspected them carefully throughout the winter. Storage demanded constant attention. Barrels formed another essential part of medieval preservation. Cabbage became fermented vegetables. Cucumbers rested in brine. Turnips soaked beneath salty water. Every household relied on wooden containers filled with foods slowly changing over weeks and months. Lifting the lid released a wave of sharp, sour aromas. Modern lovers of fermented foods might recognize familiar scents. Others would retreat immediately. Fermentation looked unsettling. Bubbles formed. Liquids clouded. Strong smells developed. Yet experienced families knew that these transformations often signaled successful preservation rather than failure. The cellar itself became the heart of survival. Cool, dark, slightly damp. Stone walls moderated temperature throughout the year. Shelves held cheese. Barrels lined the floor. Strings of onions hung from beams. Garlic dried beside bundles of herbs. Jars of preserved fruit occupied every available corner. Visitors descending into such a cellar entered a world defined entirely by smell. Earth, wood, smoke, salt, vinegar, fermentation, cheese, dry herbs. Every aroma told a story about preparation for the months ahead. The medieval nose interpreted these scents differently from ours. Today, many people instinctively associate strong smells with spoiled food. Centuries ago, strong smells often meant successful preservation. A cellar that smelled of smoke and aging cheese represented security. A smokehouse full of hanging meat represented hope. A barrel bubbling gently with fermenting vegetables promised meals during the coldest weeks of winter. Survival had its own fragrance. Of course, accidents happened. Barrels leaked. Mold spread too far. Rodents found hidden stores. Moisture ruined grain. Entire supplies disappeared because of one careless mistake or one unusually warm winter. When that happened, hunger followed quickly. The importance of preservation cannot be overstated. It determined whether villages endured harsh winters. It influenced trade. It shaped architecture. It defined seasonal labor. Entire communities measured success not simply by harvest size, but by how well that harvest survived until spring. The remarkable thing is that many preservation methods developed during the Middle Ages remain familiar today. People still smoke meat, still age cheese, still ferment vegetables, still dry herbs, still preserve fruit. Modern technology has made the process safer and more consistent, but the underlying principles remain surprisingly similar. The greatest difference lies in taste. Centuries of changing preferences have softened many traditional flavors. Modern consumers generally prefer milder cheeses, less salty meat, more controlled fermentation, cleaner aromas. Medieval diners expected exactly the opposite. They welcomed boldness. Intensity suggested quality. Powerful smells reflected successful aging rather than something to avoid. To their senses, these foods represented comfort. To ours, they often inspire hesitation. Yet even the strongest cheese or smokiest ham could not compare to what awaited guests at the grand tables of Europe's nobility. For while ordinary families worked tirelessly to preserve every scrap of food, kings and great lords searched constantly for creatures so rare, so unusual, and so expensive that serving them became a declaration of power. Some hunted deep forests, others searched distant rivers. A few demanded animals that most people would never dream of eating. The next chapter explores those extraordinary delicacies, from graceful swans and elusive cranes to eels, porpoises, and other remarkable creatures whose appearance at a medieval banquet often mattered far more than their flavor. Beasts for the banquet, the strangest animals ever served at medieval tables. For most medieval families, dinner was predictable. If fortune smiled upon them, there might be a little pork, perhaps a chicken raised in the yard, maybe a rabbit caught in a nearby field. More often than not, the meal consisted of bread, vegetables, beans, and whatever preserved foods remained from the previous season. But behind the walls of Europe's great castles, ordinary food was rarely enough. The wealthy did not simply want to eat well, they wanted to eat differently. A banquet was an opportunity to display power without speaking a single word. The rarest animal on the table often attracted more attention than the richest jewel in the room. Guests judged a lord's wealth not only by the size of his castle or the number of his servants, but also by the creatures that appeared on his dining table. The more difficult an animal was to hunt, transport, or prepare, the greater the prestige. Some dishes were admired before anyone even considered taking a bite. The hunt itself was part of the story. When noblemen rode into the forest before sunrise, accompanied by trained dogs, mounted servants, and skilled hunters, they were doing far more than searching for food. Hunting was a public display of status. Large forests were carefully protected. Game animals were often reserved for nobles by law. A peasant caught hunting deer in the wrong forest could face severe punishment. The privilege of hunting was almost as valuable as the meat itself. Among the most respected animals was the red deer. A mature stag represented strength, endurance, and nobility. Bringing one down required patience and skill. The successful hunt became a tale retold during the evening feast, while the roasted venison reminded every guest of the host's command over both land and law. Venison itself differed greatly from the beef that most modern people know. It was leaner, darker, often tougher. To soften its strong flavor, cooks marinated it in wine, vinegar, herbs, and spices before roasting it slowly over open fires. Rich sauces followed, blending cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and dried fruits into combinations that would seem almost unbelievable today. Yet deer were only the beginning. Wild boar inspired even greater admiration. Unlike domestic pigs, wild boars were dangerous. Their powerful bodies, sharp tusks, and unpredictable tempers made them formidable opponents. A wounded boar could charge hunters with astonishing speed. Dogs were injured. Horses panicked. Hunters occasionally lost their lives. Serving wild boar at a banquet therefore symbolized courage as much as wealth. The head often occupied the place of honor. Decorated with herbs, fruit, and colorful garnishes, it was carried proudly into the hall while musicians played and guests applauded. The meat itself demanded effort. Older animals could be exceptionally tough. Long hours of roasting helped, but even then the flesh required determined chewing. The spectacle outweighed the tenderness. Then there were the birds. Modern diners usually think of chicken, turkey, or duck. Medieval nobles searched for something far more impressive. Cranes appeared on elite tables, despite their famously lean meat. Their graceful appearance in life translated into prestige after death. Herons became another fashionable choice. Preparing them required considerable skill because their flesh was often dry and strongly flavored. Yet rarity mattered more than convenience. If an ordinary farmer could not easily obtain it, nobles wanted it. Bustards ranked among the largest flying birds in Europe. A fully grown great bustard could weigh well over 30 pounds. Roasting such a magnificent bird became an unforgettable centerpiece. Its sheer size astonished guests before anyone even tasted the meat. Modern readers may wonder whether these exotic birds actually tasted good. Contemporary descriptions suggest that many did not. Some were praised more for novelty than flavor. Others required elaborate sauces simply to improve the eating experience. The banquet celebrated exclusivity rather than culinary perfection. One of the most curious examples involved the humble peacock. As explored earlier, its brilliant feathers made it one of the greatest visual spectacles in medieval dining. Yet numerous historical accounts suggest that peacock meat was relatively dry and rather ordinary. Its beauty created the illusion of extraordinary flavor. Guests admired the bird because they were expected to admire it. Sometimes expectation itself became part of the meal. Rabbits occupied a different position. Wild rabbits multiplied quickly and could often be hunted more easily than larger game. Their tender meat made them popular across many social classes, though the wealthiest households prepared them with increasingly elaborate sauces featuring almonds, wine, raisins, cinnamon, and saffron. Even familiar animals became luxurious through expensive seasoning. Rivers supplied another astonishing variety of creatures. Eels were among the most prized. Their snake-like appearance unsettled some visitors, yet medieval cooks admired their rich flesh. Large eels were roasted, baked into pies, or simmered with herbs and wine. Their natural oiliness helped them remain moist during cooking. Many considered them a delicacy. Lampreys inspired even stronger reactions. Unlike ordinary fish, lampreys possess circular mouths lined with rows of sharp teeth.
Their appearance resembles something from a nightmare. Yet medieval nobles eagerly sought them. Lamprey pies became famous at royal courts, particularly in England and France. Preparing them required patience. Cleaning them was unpleasant. The finished dish, however, carried enormous prestige. Kings themselves requested lampreys during important celebrations. Not everyone enjoyed the result. Some described the flesh as unusually rich. Others found it almost overwhelming. But refusing such a prized dish would have seemed deeply impolite. The sea offered even stranger possibilities. Porpoises occasionally appeared at noble banquets. Today, most people would never imagine serving one for dinner, but medieval classifications of animals followed different logic. Since porpoises lived in the sea, they were often treated as acceptable during religious fasting periods that prohibited meat from land animals. To medieval diners, this made perfect sense. The flesh reportedly resembled very dark, oily meat rather than modern seafood. It was commonly served with strongly flavored sauces designed to balance its richness. Whales, though rarely available, occasionally contributed valuable products to medieval kitchens as well. Their meat was preserved in certain coastal regions. More importantly, whale fat provided oil, while rare substances such as ambergris found occasional use in elite cooking and perfumery. Nothing about these enormous animals was ordinary. Even beavers entered the medieval menu under unusual circumstances. Because they spent much of their lives in water and possessed broad fish-like tails, some religious authorities in certain regions allowed them to be eaten during fasting periods. Modern biology clearly identifies beavers as mammals. Medieval dietary rules sometimes focused more on habitat than anatomy. The result seems bizarre today, but reflected sincere attempts to interpret religious law. Foreign traveler often expressed amazement at these customs. The table became a meeting place for theology, tradition, and practical necessity. One particularly unusual luxury was the dormouse. Far smaller than rabbits or birds, these tiny rodents were fattened before cooking. The practice had ancient roots stretching back to the Roman world and survived in some regions for centuries. Their delicate meat appealed mainly to the wealthy, who delighted in serving unusual delicacies unavailable to ordinary people. Small birds also found their way onto banquet tables. Larks, blackbirds, quail, woodcock, snipe. Sometimes dozens were roasted together in elaborate pies or arranged across decorative platters. The portions were tiny. The labor required to catch them was enormous. That labor itself increased their value. A feast demonstrated not only what the host owned, but also how many people worked in his service. Every rare bird represented countless hours of effort. The medieval fascination with unusual animals reflected a broader desire to conquer nature. Bringing the forest, the marsh, the river, and the sea into one dining hall symbolized mastery over the surrounding world. Guests saw the evidence before them. A lord powerful enough to serve deer, crane, swan, lamprey, eel, and wild boar. On the same evening, clearly commanded impressive resources. Whether every dish tasted wonderful mattered surprisingly little.
The story behind the animal often proved more satisfying than the meat itself.
Modern historians, attempting to recreate these banquets, frequently reach the same conclusion. Many recipes are edible. Some are genuinely enjoyable. Others challenge contemporary palates with unfamiliar textures, intense spice blends, or unexpectedly gamey flavors. Yet all of them reveal something important about medieval society. Food was never merely fuel. It was language, status, religion, politics, entertainment, identity. Every creature carried meaning beyond nourishment. Ironically, while nobles competed to serve the rarest animals imaginable, ordinary villagers often transformed the simplest ingredients into meals of remarkable creativity. With little meat, limited spices, and almost no luxury goods, they invented hearty dishes from oats, cabbage, onions, beans, stale bread, and scraps that wealthier households might barely notice. Those humble recipes lacked glitter, but many proved far more practical than the extravagant banquets of kings. Some disappeared with time. Others quietly survived for centuries, eventually evolving into traditional dishes still enjoyed in parts of Europe today. Their story reminds us that history's most memorable meals were not always served beneath golden chandeliers.
Sometimes they were born beside a smoky hearth in a modest cottage, where necessity inspired an entirely different kind of culinary genius, the poor man's pot, peasant dishes that modern diners might refuse. History tends to remember the feasts of kings.
Paintings celebrate towering banquets covered with roasted swans, golden goblets, and tables overflowing with expensive spices. Chroniclers carefully recorded the meals served to princes, bishops, and wealthy merchants. Their accounts survive because the powerful could afford to preserve their stories.
But they represented only a tiny fraction of medieval society. The overwhelming majority of people would never taste peacock. They would never sprinkle saffron over their supper. They would never see sugar shaped into decorative sculptures or dine beneath the vaulted ceilings of a royal hall. Most medieval people were peasants. They worked from sunrise until darkness, planting grain, tending animals, gathering firewood, repairing fences, and preparing for winters that always seemed to arrive too quickly. Their kitchens were small, smoky, and practical. Every ingredient had to justify its place. Luxury was not part of the recipe. Survival was. If you entered a peasant cottage just before the evening meal, you would probably notice one object before anything else, a large, black cooking pot. It hung over the fire almost every day of the year. Sometimes it was emptied completely. Often it was not. Instead, fresh ingredients were added while older ones continued to simmer. The result changed gradually from day to day, creating a meal that reflected whatever happened to be available. Modern people sometimes refer to this as an everlasting stew. The exact practice varied from place to place, and it should not be imagined as a pot left continuously boiling for months without cleaning. In many households, the pot was regularly emptied and cleaned. But the idea of repeatedly adding ingredients to a familiar stew over several days was common enough that the flavor evolved with each meal. Yesterday's cabbage met today's onions. Today's onions met tomorrow's beans. Little barley thickened the broth. A handful of herbs added freshness. If a neighbor shared a small piece of bacon, the entire pot became richer. Nothing was wasted. Every spoonful carried the memory of previous meals. The stew rarely tasted exactly the same twice. Bread formed the foundation of daily life. Without bread, many families simply could not survive. Yet medieval bread often looked very different from the soft white loaves filling modern grocery stores. The finest white bread belonged to the wealthy because producing it required carefully sifted flour. Peasants usually ate darker bread made from rye, barley, oats, or mixtures of several grains. The flour contained more bran. Sometimes tiny fragments of husk remained. The texture was heavier. The flavor was earthier. During difficult years, even these ingredients became scarce. People stretched flour by mixing it with whatever could be found. Ground peas, beans, chestnuts, acorns that had been carefully processed to remove bitterness. In desperate times, records even describe bread made with tree bark flour or other emergency ingredients. Such loaves were not ordinary food, but signs of famine and hardship. Most people hoped never to need them. Porridge appeared almost as often as bread. Simple grains simmered slowly in water, or, when available, milk created a filling meal that required little expense. Oats dominated many northern regions. Barley appeared elsewhere. The finished porridge could be flavored with onions, herbs, or perhaps a little butter if the household owned dairy animals. To modern diners accustomed to sweet breakfast oatmeal, medieval porridge would seem surprisingly savory. It belonged to every meal, not just the morning. Vegetables play a far greater role than many people imagine. Cabbage, leeks, turnips, parsnips, onions, garlic, beans, peas. These crops grew reliably and stored well through much of the year. Large gardens surrounded many cottages because vegetables offered dependable nutrition even when meat became scarce. The recipes themselves remained simple. Boiled vegetables, vegetable soups, vegetables mixed with grains. Everything depended upon what the season provided. Meat was precious. A family might keep pigs, chickens, or goats, but slaughtering them too early meant losing future eggs, milk, or breeding animals. As a result, meat often appeared only on special occasions. When it did, every scrap mattered. A single piece of salted bacon might flavor an enormous pot of beans without being eaten immediately. Bones simmered into broth, fat enriched vegetables. Even the smallest leftovers found another purpose. One chicken could influence several days of meals. Modern kitchens often throw away stale bread. Medieval households viewed stale bread differently. Hard loaves were softened in soups, broken into stews, mixed into puddings, ground into crumbs for thickening sauces. Nothing edible was discarded simply because it had become dry. Bread represented far too much labor. Grain had been planted, harvested, threshed, ground, mixed, baked. Every loaf embodied months of work. Throwing it away would have seemed almost unimaginable. Wild plants quietly supplemented the medieval diet. Knowledge of local landscapes passed from parents to children over generations. People gathered nettles in spring. Sorrel added sharp flavor to soups. Dandelion greens appeared in simple salads. Blackberries and elderberries sweetened late summer meals. Hazelnuts were collected from woodland edges. Mushrooms were gathered carefully by those who understood which varieties were safe. This knowledge could mean the difference between abundance and hunger. Mistakes, however, carried terrible consequences. Poisonous plants occasionally found their way into meals. Dangerous mushrooms could resemble edible ones. Without modern field guides, experience remained the only reliable teacher. Most families learned caution early. The poor also relied heavily on legumes. Beans and peas supplied valuable protein when meat was unavailable. Large pots of pea soup became familiar sights throughout Europe. Sometimes onions and herbs improved the flavor. Sometimes only salt was available. The meals were plain, but they filled empty stomachs. One ingredient modern diners rarely consider was pottage. Unlike a specific recipe, pottage was more of a cooking method. Nearly every available ingredient could find its way into the pot. Grains, vegetables, herbs, beans, occasionally meat. The mixture simmered until thick enough to eat with bread. Rich households prepared luxurious versions. Poor families created simpler ones. Almost everyone recognized the dish. Its contents simply depended upon circumstance. Dairy products varied enormously. Families owning cows, sheep, or goats enjoyed milk, butter, and cheese when supplies allowed. Others purchased small quantities from neighbors. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so much of it became cheese or butter almost immediately. Curds, soft cheeses, and sour milk appeared frequently in peasant cooking. To modern tastes, some of these products might seem unusually sharp or tangy. They reflected practicality rather than refinement. Clean drinking water was not always guaranteed. Streams became contaminated. Wells varied in quality. As a result, weak ale accompanied many meals, including those eaten by children. This beer contained far less alcohol than most modern varieties, and was brewed regularly because the brewing process produced a safer beverage than questionable water in many places. Its flavor depended entirely on local ingredients and brewing skill. Some batches were pleasant, others were merely drinkable. Dessert, as modern people understand it, rarely existed in peasant households. Fresh fruit appeared when in season. Dried apples or pears lasted into winter. Honey sweetened special occasions if beehives were available. Most evenings simply ended when the meal ended. There was no separate course of cakes or pastries waiting afterward. Hunger itself determined satisfaction. Winter changed everything. Cellars gradually emptied. Barrels grew lighter. Cheese wheels became smaller. Salted meat disappeared. Fresh vegetables became scarce. Meals grew increasingly repetitive. Towards the end of winter, many families entered what historians sometimes call the hungry gap, the difficult period before new crops matured. Creativity became essential. every remaining ingredient mattered, every scrap found purpose. Looking back, some peasant recipes appear almost unimaginably plain. Others seem surprisingly strange. A soup made almost entirely from onions, bread softened in watered ale, boiled nettles with coarse barley, turnips cooked until nearly falling apart, beans flavored by a single piece of smoked pork shared among an entire household. These meals rarely inspired admiration. They inspired endurance. Yet there is another side to this story. Many modern chefs have recreated medieval peasant recipes and discovered that simplicity does not always mean unpleasantness. Fresh vegetable pottages can be deeply comforting. Dark rye bread possesses remarkable flavor. Slow-cooked beans remain satisfying today. Herb-filled broths reveal surprising complexity. Not every humble meal deserves its reputation. The true shock comes not from the ingredients themselves, but from how little people often had. A modern pantry overflows with choices. A medieval peasant measured success by having enough grain to reach the next harvest. That difference changes the meaning of every recipe. When survival becomes the primary goal, luxury fades into the background. Flavor matters, but nourishment matters more. The poor learn to create filling meals from almost nothing, and in doing so they develop traditions rooted in resilience rather than extravagance. Ironically, while peasants struggled to stretch every crumb of bread and every handful of beans, the wealthy searched constantly for new ways to astonish their guests with spectacular sweets. Expensive sugar, imported spices, almond milk, dried fruits, and elaborate pastries transformed the final course into a dazzling display of status. Some of those desserts looked magnificent. Others combined ingredients in ways that modern diners might find completely bewildering. Meat appeared where fruit was expected. Pepper found its way into sweet dishes, rosewater-scented puddings, and beneath their beautiful appearance, some of history's strangest desserts quietly waited to surprise anyone brave enough to take the first bite. What these disgusting recipes really tell us. By now, the medieval dinner table has become a very different place from the one most people imagine. We have wandered through smoke-filled kitchens where fish hung drying from wooden beams. We have opened barrels filled with salted meat and fermented vegetables. We have watched cooks collect fresh blood before turning it into soups and sausages. We have seen brains folded into pastries, tongues carefully boiled, and stomachs transformed into cooking vessels. We have followed merchants carrying cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and saffron across continents, only for those precious spices to be scattered over roasted meat, fish, and pies. We have stood inside magnificent castles where peacocks return to the table wearing their own colorful feathers, and giant pastries burst open with live birds fluttering into crowded banquet halls. And we have stepped into humble cottages where a single pot of cabbage, beans, onions, and coarse bread kept entire families alive through another unforgiving winter. Looking at these meals through modern eyes, one question naturally appears. How could anyone possibly eat this? The answer is both surprisingly simple and deeply human.
because they didn't think it was disgusting. Disgust is not fixed. It changes, it travels, it evolves with culture, history, geography, and experience. A child growing up in medieval England did not compare blood pudding with pizza. A fisherman living on the North Sea coast did not compare fermented fish with sushi. A French monk did not compare almond milk with oat lattes. Those comparisons simply did not exist. People judged food against what they already knew. Their expectations shaped every bite. The same process continues today. Around the world, foods that one culture treasures often confuse another. Some people happily eat insects, others enjoy fermented shark. Some prize century eggs. Others celebrate intensely aged cheeses that fill entire rooms with powerful aromas. Many cultures consider organ meats valuable delicacies. Others avoid them completely. None of these reactions are determined entirely by the food itself. They are shaped by memory, family, tradition, habit. What feels comforting often depends on what surrounded us as children. Medieval people inherited a world very different from ours. Their kitchens lacked electricity. Their markets depended upon the seasons. Their farms relied on weather that could change without warning. A failed harvest threatened entire communities. Winter stretched for months. Preserving food was not an interesting hobby. It was survival. Every unusual recipe reflected that reality. Salted fish existed because fresh fish spoiled. Blood was eaten because wasting nutrition was dangerous. Bones became broth because every calorie mattered. Organs reached the table because they were valuable food, not unwanted leftovers. Strong cheese developed because aging extended its life. Smoke-flavored meat because smoke protected it. Nothing appeared by accident. Every strange ingredient solved a problem. Even the extravagant recipes of kings followed similar logic. Spices demonstrated wealth because obtaining them required enormous trade networks. Sugar represented luxury because it traveled incredible distances before reaching Europe. Peacocks impressed guests because rarity itself communicated power. Every feast became a carefully planned message. We are wealthy. We are connected. We can afford what others cannot. Food became language. It spoke before anyone opened their mouth. Religion also shaped nearly every meal. Fasting days altered diets for weeks at a time. Fish replaced meat. Almond milk replaced dairy. Creative interpretations of religious rules introduced animals that modern people would never expect to find on the menu. These choices were rarely made for novelty. They reflected sincere attempts to live according to deeply held beliefs. Medicine entered the kitchen as naturally as cooking. Physicians prescribed foods according to theories now abandoned, but once accepted throughout Europe. Meals promised balance, strength, warmth, healing. Some remedies failed completely. Others accidentally contained ingredients that modern science recognizes as genuinely beneficial. Knowledge grew slowly, built one generation at a time. Mistakes and discoveries lived side by side. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside medieval recipes is that necessity
encourages extraordinary creativity. Give a skilled cook only onions, cabbage, stale bread, herbs, and a little bacon. A meal appears. Offer another cook blood, oats, spices, and cleaned intestines. Sausages emerge. Provide milk that will spoil tomorrow. Cheese is born. The medieval kitchen wasted remarkably little because it simply could not afford to. In many ways, modern society has reversed that relationship. Food is abundant in many parts of the world. Supermarkets remain stocked throughout the year. Refrigerators preserve ingredients for days or weeks. Freezers extend that period even further. When something spoils, many people replace it without much thought. Medieval families rarely enjoyed that luxury. Their respect for food grew directly from its scarcity. That perspective may be one of the most valuable things history still offers us. Not every medieval recipe deserves revival. Some would almost certainly disappoint modern palates. Others depended upon preservation methods that are no longer considered safe without careful controls. A few relied on medical ideas that science has long since rejected. Yet hidden among those unfamiliar dishes are ideas that continue to influence our kitchens. Slow cooking, fermentation, pickling, smoking, bone broth, artisan cheese, fresh herbs, seasonal eating, using more parts of an animal. Many practices celebrated by contemporary chefs have roots reaching deep into medieval life. The difference lies in refinement, safety, and changing taste. History has softened the edges. Perhaps that is why medieval cooking remains so fascinating. It reminds us that taste is never permanent. What one century rejects, another may rediscover. What seems ordinary today may puzzle future generations. Even now, chefs around the world are recreating forgotten medieval recipes, not because they expect every dish to become a modern favorite, but because each recipe offers a glimpse into the minds of people who lived hundreds of years ago. Every loaf of coarse bread tells a story about harvests. Every smoked ham speaks of winter. Every spice whispers of distant oceans and dangerous trade routes. Every bowl of pottage reflects patience. Every extravagant banquet reveals ambition. Every preserved fish reminds us that survival once demanded ingenuity far beyond what most of us experience today. The medieval table was never merely a place to eat. It was where science, religion, economics, politics, agriculture, medicine, family, and culture met every single day. That is why these recipes matter. Not because they were delicious, not because they were revolting, but because they reveal the everyday lives of millions of people who face challenges we can barely imagine. The next time you open a refrigerator filled with fresh food, pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that simple act would have seemed to someone living 700 years ago. They would have marveled at fruit available in winter, at meat that stayed fresh for days, at milk that remained safe without becoming cheese by necessity, at clean drinking water flowing from a tap, at spices affordable enough to sit unnoticed in an ordinary kitchen cabinet. And perhaps they would have looked at our own eating habits with the same confusion that we often reserve for theirs. History has a remarkable way of changing perspective.
The meals that once seemed shocking become understandable. The dishes that appeared disgusting become stories of resilience. The recipes that inspired disbelief become reminders that humanity has always adapted, experimented, and found ways to survive. In the end, the most surprising ingredient in every medieval recipe was never blood, fermented fish, organ meat, or overpowering spices. It was human ingenuity. That ingenuity transformed scarcity into nourishment, fear into tradition, necessity into cuisine, and simple survival into a culinary history that continues to fascinate us centuries later. The flavors may have faded, the kitchens may have disappeared, but the stories remain, waiting for anyone curious enough to pull up a chair at history's oldest table and discover what was truly on the menu.